You know how some meetings feel like they change the trajectory of your whole life? Mine didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened at a cybersecurity conference in downtown Boston. 3 years ago, back when my future felt wide open and entirely mine. I was up on stage, consulting independently, presenting my predictive threat architecture, a genuinely revolutionary concept, if I can say so myself. Most of those audiences are just there for the catered lunch or the networking drinks, scrolling through their feeds while you drone on about encryption protocols. But then there was Ethan Caldwell. He was sitting in the very last row, and the shocking thing was he was actually taking notes. Head down, pen moving steadily across a crisp notepad, genuinely engaged as I explained how my framework could identify vulnerabilities before attackers even recognized they existed. After the session, during the Q&A, he raised his hand and asked a question that stopped me cold. It was technical, deep, about scaling the architecture across distributed systems without creating latency issues. It wasn't the kind of shallow, marketing speak question you get from an executive. It proved he'd been listening, really listening, and that alone made him different from every other suit in the room. He waited patiently after the session while 3 other consultants tried to shove their business cards into my hand. When he finally approached, his smile felt genuine, not rehearsed, and we ended up talking for 2 hours in the hotel lobby, sipping lukewarm coffee. He represented Caldwell Technologies, his family's firm, but he spoke about it with a measured distance, like someone who respected the business without being consumed by it. He asked intelligent questions about my work, shared insights about industry gaps, and listened when I explained my theories about where security was heading. When he asked for my contact information, it felt professional. When he called 3 days later to invite me to dinner, it felt like a door opening to possibility. Our courtship unfolded with what I interpreted as respectful deliberation. First, casual dinners, then a weekend trip up to Cape Cod where we walked empty beaches and talked about everything except work. My childhood growing up with my mom, his complex relationship with his titan of industry father, Victor. Ethan never rushed me. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, always checking in to make sure I was comfortable with each step forward. At the time, that patience felt like absolute respect. I felt seen, not acquired. Looking back now, I can see the chilling subtext. It was an assessment. Every stage was a test to see if I'd fit perfectly into the space he'd already designated for me within the gilded cage of the Caldwell world. 6 months in, Ethan took me back to that same hotel lobby where we first talked. He proposed over coffee, not champagne, in jeans, not a suit, with a ring that was beautiful but understated. It felt authentic, like he understood I valued substance over performance. I said yes before he'd finished asking, certain I'd found someone who saw Ava Monroe, the resilient, self-made architect, as an equal. But my mother, Eleanor, saw through the veneer immediately. You have to understand Eleanor. She's not just my mom. She's a nurse who's worked double shifts in the trauma unit of the same city hospital for 30 years. She's the definition of grit, raising me alone after my dad passed, putting me through college without debt by sheer force of will. When I called her with the news, there was a long, heavy silence on the line. "That's wonderful, honey," she finally said, her voice slow and careful. "But just remember this. Families like the Caldwells operate differently than people like us. They live by different rules. You'll always be an outsider to them, no matter what Ethan promises you. Be smart, Ava. Protect yourself." I dismissed her concern as generational cynicism, the worldview of someone who'd spent her life struggling to make ends meet and couldn't imagine wealth operating with genuine meritocracy. Ethan had assured me repeatedly that his father, Victor, valued expertise and results, that he built his company by recognizing talent regardless of background or pedigree. I believed him because the alternative, that I was walking into something far more complicated than love, was too painful to acknowledge. Eleanor's quiet, steady voice, the voice that had comforted countless patients and grounded me through 2 decades, was the only weather warning I chose to ignore. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was my first and most catastrophic mistake. I thought I was marrying a man. I was actually marrying a corporation. The wedding took place 8 months later. It was beautiful, but the undercurrent of unspoken expectations was already there, hidden just beneath the surface of the perfect white linen. And the real performance was about to begin. Ethan and his father were already planning the next act. They just hadn't told me my role yet. Getting married to Ethan didn't change my last name, which was a point of friction I chose to overlook. I insisted on keeping Monroe, maintaining a fiercely independent professional identity. Looking back, that decision was the first subtle act of rebellion against the Caldwell machine. A machine, by the way, that had been preparing my new office long before I walked down the aisle. 2 weeks after our honeymoon, Victor, my new father-in-law, the imposing figure who dominated every room he entered, called me into his lavish executive office on the 40th floor of the Caldwell Tower in Midtown Manhattan. The view of the New York skyline was breathtaking, but the atmosphere was suffocating. "Ava," he began, not looking up from a file that was almost certainly empty. "You're family now. That means you're protected, but it also means you contribute. No more of this independent contracting, charging outrageous fees." I remember feeling a sudden knot in my stomach. I was making approximately $350,000 a year as a specialized consultant, a rate earned through years of 20-hour days and proprietary research. I was ready to discuss a director or VP role, something commensurate with my expertise. Instead, Victor slid an employment contract across the mahogany desk. "You'll take a position in our information systems division," he stated, his tone brooking no argument. "You'll be a senior security analyst. The salary is $160,000 plus standard benefits. You'll be reporting to Tom, a fine man, but someone you should be able to learn from." The offer was insulting. It was less than half my market rate, and the role described was purely operational, maintaining legacy systems, running routine vulnerability scans, and filing compliance reports. It was administrative grunt work, the kind of job I used to delegate to junior staff a decade ago. I blinked, trying to remain composed. "Victor, with all due respect, my specialization is in predictive architecture and quantum-proof encryption," I said, leaning forward. "That salary is significantly below industry standard for my level of experience, and I believe I could add more value in a strategic role, perhaps leading the initiative to integrate AI threat detection across our subsidiaries." Victor finally looked up, and the expression in his eyes was pure, cold disdain. It was the look of a patriarch watching a child try to talk their way out of a grounding. "Ava, you're brilliant, we know that. But at Caldwell, we do things our way. We need stability. We need to know you're committed to the family, not just chasing the biggest paycheck. This is a chance for you to prove you can be a team player, to solidify your foundation here." He leaned back, a small, condescending smile playing on his lips. "It's also an excellent way to stabilize your home life with Ethan. That's important to us. Besides," he added, throwing a casual grenade, "at your age, stability is far more important than chasing consultant glamour. This is protection. At your age." That dismissive phrase, suggesting my time for high-risk, high-reward ventures, was over hit me harder than the low salary. It was a calculated insult, a reminder that they saw me not as a professional asset, but as Ethan's ambitious wife who needed to be kept busy and, most importantly, under control. I realized then what my mother had warned me about. They didn't want my talent. They wanted my compliance. They wanted to neutralize my threat level, keeping my innovative mind focused on filing compliance reports instead of disrupting their outdated business model. I walked out of that office feeling physically sick, but the pride I had inherited from Eleanor wouldn't let me back down or start a confrontation that early. I signed the contract. I accepted the role reporting to Tom, a perfectly nice man in his late 50s who was clearly perplexed by having a globally recognized expert doing basic firewall maintenance under him. I quickly understood the purpose of my job. I was the token diversity hire, the intellectual trophy wife who they could point to at shareholder meetings while ensuring I never got close enough to the core of the business to reveal how stagnant their technology truly was. My days became a blur of routine. I attended meetings where I was subtly ignored. I presented detailed proposals for system upgrades that were met with polite nods and promptly filed away. I watched as Caldwell Technologies relied on brittle, aging security frameworks, and I was explicitly instructed to stick to the script when dealing with vendors. I felt my professional soul shriveling, replaced by the crushing banality of corporate bureaucracy. But every time I felt the urge to quit, I remembered Victor's dismissive smirk. I remembered Eleanor's warning. Quitting would confirm their suspicion that I lacked the discipline for long-haul corporate life, that I was just a flash in the pan. So I stayed. I kept my head down. I logged my hours, smiled politely at Victor's wife, Carol, during their stiff Sunday brunches where she asked if I'd started thinking about redecorating the condo yet, completely ignoring my work. I played the role of the dutiful, slightly underutilized daughter-in-law. But beneath that compliant exterior, the architect was still building. I was gathering data, analyzing their structural weaknesses, and meticulously planning my own separate, secret foundation. The seed of Monroe Security Solutions had been planted in the barren ground of Caldwell Tech, and it was about to germinate in the most unexpected way. It was time to stop doing Victor's menial work and start building something that truly mattered, something they would never see coming. The environment at Caldwell Tech wasn't just professionally stifling, it was dangerous. I wasn't just filing dull reports. I was filing reports on critical vulnerabilities that went unaddressed because addressing them would mean admitting the massive capital expense needed for a complete infrastructure overhaul, something Victor Caldwell simply wouldn't approve. He operated under the deeply flawed, old-school belief that if you couldn't see the threat, it wasn't there. He was prioritizing quarterly profits over existential risk, a classic blunder of the aging CEO clinging to the past. This realization fueled my growing anger, but more importantly, it galvanized my focus. I had signed Victor's contract, accepting the low salary and the humiliating role, but the small print he hadn't focused on was the explicit language around intellectual property. My contract, being boilerplate for non-executive staff, only claimed IP developed on company time, using company resources, and directly related to assigned projects. My assigned projects were maintenance. My time after 5 p.m. and before 8 a.m. was mine. And the core project I began to develop was light years beyond anything Caldwell Tech was capable of even conceptualizing. For 6 solid months, my life became a meticulous double existence. While the Caldwell family thought I was winding down with Ethan, ordering takeout, and catching up on prestige TV, I was locked away in a small rented office space in a nondescript building in the outer boroughs, far away from our penthouse in the city. The rent was paid out of my independent consulting savings, a secret stash Ethan knew nothing about. This space was sterile, anonymous, and perfect. It housed 2 high-spec servers, a secure VPN tunnel, and enough coffee to power a small nation. It was there, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, that Sentinel Protocol was born. It wasn't just a piece of software. It was a revolutionary, self-optimizing security architecture. It used predictive algorithms to map threat vectors and, crucially, automatically rerouted and re-encrypted data packets before a malicious connection could be fully established. It was a digital immune system, not just a wall. It was everything Victor's system wasn't: proactive, adaptable, and fundamentally secure. The paperwork was handled by a specialist IP attorney in Delaware, far away from the Caldwell family's usual legal counsel. I incorporated Monroe Security Solutions, MSS, listing myself as the sole owner and inventor. The patents were filed under the MSS umbrella, not my personal name, creating a crucial layer of professional separation. The entire process was conducted with the kind of ruthless, clinical efficiency I hadn't allowed myself to use in my personal life, but which I fully embraced in my professional one. This was my legacy, my insurance policy, and my weapon. I remember the night I finished the final code review and filed the last patent application. It was 3 a.m. The city was silent. I leaned back in my worn office chair, staring at the monitor displaying the green confirmation message. It felt like delivering a baby, exhausting, terrifying, and profoundly real. This was the work I was meant to do, work that Victor had tried to silence by giving me a pathetic salary and a plastic badge. I felt an exhilarating, dangerous sense of freedom. The second part of the plan was the most delicate: getting Caldwell Tech to adopt the technology without knowing who owned it. Victor was too cheap to spend money on true innovation, but he was cheap enough to be lured by a too-good-to-be-true deal. Through a carefully orchestrated series of meetings involving an intermediary broker and a shell company that positioned Sentinel Protocol as a disruptive, off-the-shelf solution, Caldwell Tech purchased a license to use the core framework for a single, non-transferable application layer. The price was low, seemingly a bargain, but the contract was airtight, stipulating absolute confidentiality and, critically, a good faith clause governing the relationship between the licensor, MSS, and the licensee, Caldwell Tech. Victor Caldwell was reportedly smug about the deal, bragging to Ethan that he'd snatched up $1 million piece of tech for a pittance, completely unaware that he had just invited the Trojan horse into the Citadel. I sat in his office when the final papers were signed, watching the transaction from my humble senior analyst desk. Victor smiled at me and said, "Sieva, that's how business is done. You'll learn." The irony was so rich, it was practically toxic. I had learned, right? I had learned that when they try to cage you, you don't fight the bars. You just become the architect of a new prison for them, using their own blind greed as the blueprint. The installation of Sentinel Protocol across Caldwell's core systems was smooth, implemented by an external team that was naturally, but unknowingly, guided by my detailed maintenance reports. I was now managing the system that was secretly managed by me. It was beautiful, terrifying, and completely undetectable. As the months passed, my marriage continued to decay, a slow, inevitable process mirrored by the growing vulnerability of Victor's empire. The clock was ticking, and the family who thought they had bought my silence was about to find out that they had simply paid for the right to rent their own demise. The storm was coming, and I was the one who had filed the flight path. The meticulous architecture of the Sentinel Protocol was humming smoothly in the background, keeping Caldwell Tech safe while I, the true architect, maintained the facade of an underpaid analyst. But as my professional life became a calculated strategy, my personal life with Ethan began its quiet, agonizing disintegration. It started subtly, around our first wedding anniversary. The champagne tasted flat, and the surprise trip Ethan planned to the Hamptons felt less like a romantic getaway and more like a required corporate appearance. Ethan started checking his phone obsessively during dinner. His eyes, which had once held such genuine interest in my conference presentations, now glazed over when I tried to explain a complex vulnerability patch or a new idea I'd had. He'd step into the bedroom to take calls from Victor that couldn't possibly wait until morning. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague and distracted, offering no real information about what was consuming so much of his attention. It felt like he was actively erasing me from his cognitive map. I tried everything I could imagine to revive what we'd had. I planned elaborate, old-fashioned date nights, reservations at the Italian place where we had our second date, tickets to a jazz club downtown. He'd cancel last minute, his face a mask of practiced regret, citing unforeseen strategic obligations Victor needed him for. Weekend getaways to the Berkshires never materialized because Victor needed him for a meeting or a strategy session. It was always Victor. Victor's needs eclipsed mine, our marriage, and any pretense of a shared future. I initiated conversations about our plans, our goals, the life we talked about building together, and watched his eyes wander, mentally composing his grocery list while waiting for me to finish talking. The dynamic was brutally clear. I was an inconvenience. His father was a priority. And the more he prioritized his father's approval, the more distant and functional our relationship became. Our conversations contracted to pure logistics. Whose turn to pick up the dry cleaning, which bills needed paying, whether we had an event that weekend. There was no passion, no intimacy, just coordination. I blamed myself for months. I internalized the distance, wondering if I wasn't affectionate enough or too focused on my work, the secret work, the real work. I auditioned desperately for a role, the loving, supportive wife, for a husband who had already written the conclusion of our story. Then there were the family dinners at the Caldwell estate in Wellesley, which became regular events that felt like torture disguised as tradition. Carol, Victor's wife and Ethan's mother, was a master of the subtle, perfectly polished insult. She'd compliment my dress while subtly implying it wasn't quite appropriate professional attire for a Caldwell wife. She'd ask pointedly about my career ambitions, phrasing her inquiry to suggest that ambition itself was somehow unseemly in a woman whose primary role should be supporting her husband. But the worst part was always the questions about children. "Ava, darling," Carol would say, her smile wide and artificial, "when are you and Ethan going to provide us with grandchildren? You know, Victor is getting on, and having a family legacy is so important at his age." The way she framed it, my value was purely biological, a vessel for the Caldwell lineage. The comments were specifically designed to remind me that I was an outsider, that my professional achievements were irrelevant in their closed circle, and that I was failing to perform my most critical duty. It was the ultimate disrespect to everything my hard-working mother, Eleanor, had taught me about earning my own way. Ethan, the man who had supposedly loved my strength and independence, sat through these dinners in strategic silence. He would methodically cut his prime rib with surgical precision, never once defending me, never once redirecting his mother's commentary. His silence felt like complicity, like agreement expressed through strategic absence. He was insulating himself, protecting his place in the hierarchy, proving his loyalty to the family name over his commitment to his wife. This realization was more painful than Victor's initial professional slight. It revealed a core moral cowardice I hadn't seen before. Late at night, lying in the king-size bed next to a man who felt increasingly like a stranger sharing my space, I'd stare at the vaulted ceiling and try to identify the exact moment when everything had shifted. But there was no single moment. It was erosion, gradual, relentless, the slow, patient work of water wearing down stone until the foundation developed cracks too deep to repair. I was beginning to understand that the life I'd built with Ethan Caldwell had been constructed on borrowed ground, paid for with the currency of my own self-deception. I just didn't realize how soon the lease would expire, or how brutal the eviction would be. But deep down, the architect in me knew the foundation was compromised. The Sentinel protocol, tucked away on its encrypted servers, wasn't just my IP. It was my lifeboat, and in the silence of that cold, luxurious bedroom, I quietly made a vow. I would no longer be dependent on their approval, their resources, or their name. I was ready for the next phase. I was ready to use my own architecture to dismantle theirs. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Performance evaluation. Quarterly review. Your presence is required. Conference room B. 8:30 a.m. The phrasing was odd. I had attended dozens of quarterly reviews at Caldwell, and they were always collaborative team assessments, not individual performance evaluations. But I'm a professional, and I was still naive enough to believe in the power of data. I pushed the unease aside and prepared thoroughly, compiling 3 years of documentation into a presentation that told an undeniable story of excellence. My division had prevented 3 major, nation-state level security breaches in the past year alone. Any one of those incidents could have cost Caldwell Technologies hundreds of millions in damages and regulatory penalties. We'd exceeded performance targets by 42%. Client satisfaction scores had risen steadily under my oversight. I had every reason to expect recognition, perhaps even a discussion about a long overdue advancement. I arrived at 8:15 a.m., tablet loaded with charts and graphs, feeling confident, maybe even proud. The conference room, however, was set to an almost Arctic temperature, not physically, but emotionally. Victor Caldwell sat at the head of the immense mahogany table, his usual position of imposing authority. But the people flanking him made my stomach clench. Marcus, from operations, a man I'd interacted with perhaps twice in 3 years, and a woman in a severe dark suit I didn't recognize, holding a legal pad with the careful posture of someone whose job involved witnessing things and documenting them precisely. No one from my team was present, not a single person who could corroborate my work, speak to the actual metrics, or provide any counterweight to the narrative that was about to be constructed. I should have recognized the obvious setup and walked out, isolated, outnumbered, facing people with no direct knowledge of my contributions. But I took my seat, setting my tablet across from Victor, ready to present the cold, hard data. Victor didn't smile, didn't offer coffee, didn't acknowledge the presentation I'd clearly prepared. He simply shuffled a stack of papers with theatrical, unhurried precision, each movement designed to make me wait, wonder, and feel the weight of my own uncertainty. When he finally looked up, his voice carried the smooth, practiced authority of someone who delivered bad news often and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. "Ava," he began, using my first name with a familiarity that felt clinical and distant in this context. "We've been reviewing your division's performance metrics over the past several quarters. Unfortunately, the results are simply not meeting our expectations or the standards we've set for leadership within the Caldwell firm." The words registered individually before assembling into meaning. Not meeting expectations. Standards for leadership. I actually thought for a moment he was talking about someone else's division, that I'd been called to the wrong meeting. Then I saw his expression, not apologetic, not uncomfortable, but deeply satisfied. A wave of terrible clarity washed over me. This was the meeting. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. But last quarter's numbers exceeded every projection by a significant margin. We beat targets by 42% across all key performance indicators. The security upgrades I implemented saved the company an estimated $4 million in potential breach damages. Client satisfaction scores have improved by 28%. I reached for my tablet, my fingers moving automatically to pull up the spreadsheets, the visual representation of undeniable success. Victor didn't even glance at the screen. He just smiled, and the expression was the cold, hollow smile of someone who had already won, who held all the meaningful cards, who knew that facts and evidence were utterly irrelevant compared to the raw power to simply decide the outcome and enforce it. "This isn't personal, Ava. It's business," he delivered the tired cliché with the casual confidence of a man absolving himself of responsibility. The absurdity of it, firing someone based on fabricated performance issues, was almost impressive in its cowardice. He slid an envelope across the table. My full name was typed on the front in formal business font, Ms. Ava Monroe. Not Ava Caldwell, not even the casual Ava. Monroe. The use of my maiden name felt intentional, a subtle assertion that I'd never truly belonged to their family, that whatever connection I'd thought existed through marriage was being formally severed. "Your termination is effective immediately," Victor continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from a script. "Security will escort you to your desk to collect personal belongings. Your access credentials will be deactivated as of 9 o'clock this morning." The woman with the legal pad made a precise, careful note. Marcus stared at a spot somewhere past my left shoulder, unwilling to acknowledge my existence. I sat there, holding that envelope, my termination letter, and understood everything. This was about power, control, and Victor's deeply rooted fear of being eclipsed. I had become too competent, too visible, too successful in ways that reflected well on me rather than on him. My success was a threat, a challenge to his narrative of singular genius, and he needed to eliminate the threat before it grew too large. In that moment, the adrenaline hit, not as panic, but as a chilling, focused rage. "I remember the way out, Victor," I said quietly, looking directly into his eyes, holding the gaze until he was the one who looked away first. "It's the same path I used when I built half the systems currently keeping this company operational. The systems that prevented those 3 breaches. The infrastructure that's generating the revenue that pays for this conference room and whatever satisfaction you're getting from this moment." His expression flickered. A millisecond of uncertainty, the ghost of a recognition that he'd perhaps miscalculated something important. But it passed quickly, replaced by the smug satisfaction of a man who believed his plan was perfect and that I was utterly powerless. He had no idea what I had just taken with me. The severance of that connection meant the severance of a far more critical lifeline. The drive home felt surreal, disconnected, like watching footage of someone else's life. I was still functioning on autopilot, my hands making the familiar turns through downtown Boston, while my mind cycled uselessly through disbelief, anger, and the cold, hard fact that 3 years of my professional life had been reduced to the chipped coffee mug and the small succulent plant in the cardboard box resting on the passenger seat. I pulled into the parking garage of our downtown loft apartment, a new, sharp fear crystallizing beneath the shock. I would have to tell Ethan that his father had fired me. Would he defend me? Would he demand answers from Victor? Or would he? The thought trailed off, but some deep primal instinct already knew the answer. The emotional divestment he had practiced over the last year had been preparation. The key turned in the lock with its familiar click. I pushed open the apartment door, expecting emptiness, maybe silence, a few hours to process before the inevitable confrontation. Instead, I found Ethan waiting. The staging was immediate and obvious. He was sitting at our kitchen island, positioned deliberately with a glass of expensive scotch in front of him, despite the hour being barely past 10:30 a.m. His posture was too casual, too prepared. His laptop was open, angled just enough that I could see single-occupancy real estate listings on the screen. Apartments filtered for one bedroom, designed for a man living alone. "You're home early," he said, his tone carrying no surprise whatsoever. No alarm, just flat acknowledgement. The same voice he might use if I'd returned from running an errand. No question about why I'd come home unexpectedly in the middle of a workday. I set the pathetic cardboard box of personal items on the marble counter between us. "Your father fired me," I stated, watching his face carefully for any sign of genuine reaction. Cited poor results as the reason. Funny thing, my results were actually the best in company history. 42% above target for $1 million saved. But apparently, that doesn't meet the Caldwell expectations. Ethan took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. I watched something shift in his expression. Not guilt, which would have required him to feel he'd done something wrong. Not shock, which would have meant this information was news to him. Just a kind of resigned finality. The look of someone who'd been waiting for this specific conversation to arrive and was now relieved to finally have it happening so he could move on to whatever came next. He reached into a leather portfolio sitting on the counter, expensive leather, the kind with his initials embossed in gold, and slid a folded piece of paper across the marble surface toward me. The gesture was careful, deliberate, practiced. He'd prepared this document, positioned it for easy access. This wasn't spontaneous. I picked up the paper and unfolded it with hands that had started to shake slightly. What I found inside made my breath catch in a way that the firing itself hadn't quite managed. It was a printed list of 6 women's shelters in the greater Boston area, complete with addresses and phone numbers. Each one was highlighted in yellow marker. One was circled in blue pen with a handwritten annotation in Ethan's distinctive angular script. Closest to the red line. He'd taken the time to research transit access. He'd evaluated which shelter would be most convenient for a woman without a car, without resources, without anywhere else to go. The cruelty of it was almost artful in its precision. Not just abandonment, but abandonment with a transit map. Not just rejection, but rejection with meticulously planned logistics. "Now that you're unemployed," Ethan said, his voice completely stripped of anything resembling emotion or personal connection, "this arrangement doesn't work for me anymore. I need someone who can contribute, someone who's ascending, not falling." Falling. The words landed like physical blows. This man, whom I had defended to my own mother, was talking about our marriage like it was a failed business partnership. I was being evaluated on the same metrics as a quarterly earnings report, and I'd been found insufficient. "You knew," I whispered, and it wasn't a question. His slight nod confirmed it. "Dad told me last week that he was planning to restructure your division. I figured we should both prepare for new chapters in our lives." It seemed like the practical thing to do. Restructure. The euphemism was beautiful in its cowardice. I stood there, holding that shelter list, and suddenly the full architecture of their betrayal assembled itself in my mind with devastating clarity. This wasn't impulse. This was coordination, a strategy executed between father and son with the same precision they applied to any business deal. Ethan had spent an entire week knowing his father intended to fire me, knowing he himself intended to end our marriage, and he'd maintain the performance of normal life. The shame of that realization burned hotter than the anger. I had been so carefully managed, so thoroughly manipulated. "I'll be gone by morning," I stated, pulling dignity from some reserve I hadn't known I possessed. Ethan looked genuinely relieved. He'd clearly anticipated tears, desperate arguments. My calm acceptance registered as the best possible outcome. A clean break. What he failed to see was the cold, sharp-edged clarity that had just crystallized in my chest. They thought they had discarded an inconvenient wife and a failed employee. They were about to discover they had just terminated their license agreement with the true architect of their entire empire. I packed methodically that evening, operating on a level of focused attachment that only pure survival instinct can provide. Ethan stayed in the living room, probably scrolling through those real estate listings, planning his clean, unburdened next chapter. I didn't take everything that would have required multiple trips and extended this humiliation over more time than I could stand. I took only what was actually mine, rather than the props in the life I'd been performing. I left behind the jewelry Ethan had given me for birthdays and anniversaries, expensive pieces that had never felt quite like mine, always too ostentatious, too much about displaying wealth and expressing anything personal. I left the designer clothes Carol had encouraged me to buy, garments that had never fit quite right because they were designed for someone playing a role I was incapable of inhabiting. I stripped the condo of every material trapping of the Caldwell world. What I took, what truly mattered, were the keys to my professional kingdom. My personal laptop, which contained 3 years of work and independent research. My encrypted backup drives labeled innocuously as personal photos and family documents. And most critically, the external hard drive I'd kept hidden in the back of my closet, which contained every patent filing, every line of proprietary code, every piece of legal documentation related to Monroe Security Solutions, MSS. As I zipped up my second and final suitcase, I walked through the apartment one last time. I looked at the abstract painting in the dining room, the one I had spent hours selecting, the one Ethan had casually approved, and realized it meant nothing. My attachment wasn't to the objects. It was to the idea of the future they represented, an idea that had been brutally murdered just hours before. The shame I felt was for believing the fantasy, not for the failure of the marriage. I left the condo before dawn the next morning, carrying 2 suitcases and the pathetic cardboard box from my office. The city was still dark, street lights casting orange pools on empty sidewalks as I loaded everything into my car. I drove straight downtown to the Riverside Hotel, a mid-range establishment where the front desk staff asked no questions when I paid cash for a week's stay and requested a room on the upper floors with decent wireless reception. Room 847 became my operations center. The space was generic, bland art on the walls, furniture designed for temporary occupancy, but it was mine. I spread my laptop and backup drives across the small desk, positioning everything with the methodical precision of someone preparing for surgery. The lighting was terrible for extended computer work, but I didn't care. I pulled up the licensing agreements I had drafted 2 years earlier when Caldwell Technologies had first acquired what they believed was my security framework. I began reviewing every clause with the focused intensity of someone whose entire future and Victor's downfall depended on the accuracy of legal language written in a very different emotional state. The Sentinel Protocol, which powered every significant security system at Caldwell Technologies, was not theirs. They had licensed it from Monroe Security Solutions, the shell company I'd registered in Delaware, specifically to protect my IP. The 37-page license agreement was dense, technical, and legal, which was exactly why Victor's lawyers had skimmed it rather than studied it. They assumed it was standard boilerplate. They were catastrophically wrong. Buried deep in Section 12, subsection D, was a clause I'd written with particular care: unilateral termination rights in the event of material breach of good faith dealing with the intellectual property creator. Section 19 defined the creator explicitly and exclusively as the individual or entity holding primary patents on the licensed technology, which was me, Ava Monroe, through MSS. The license renewal date was exactly 72 hours away. Without my explicit approval, their entire security infrastructure would begin experiencing cascading failures. I sat there, reading the documents until my eyes burned, and then I began drafting the formal notice that would trigger everything that came next. I was no longer a victim seeking shelter. I was the architect preparing to demolish the false edifice they had built on my back. It was 2:15 in the morning. I was unable to sleep despite an exhaustion that made my hands shake slightly as I typed. I finalized the language of the formal notice. Brief, professionally phrased, almost polite in its tone, a chilling masterpiece of corporate revenge. Pursuant to Section 12D of License Agreement MT 2847, Monroe Security Solutions hereby provides notice of material breach regarding treatment of intellectual property creator. The phrase material breach was the key. Getting fired for fabricated poor performance, when the data showed the exact opposite, was a textbook definition of acting in bad faith toward the creator of the core IP. Victor had just committed the legal equivalent of suicide by arrogance. Automatic license renewal is suspended pending contract renegotiation and resolution of outstanding grievances. This suspension becomes effective at 0600 hours Eastern Standard Time on September 24th. I attached a PDF copy of the original licensing agreement, with the specific provisions highlighted in yellow marker, the very same color Ethan had used when highlighting homeless shelters on the list he'd prepared for my convenience. The visual parallel felt appropriate, a small, dark gesture of symmetry. I scheduled the email to send automatically at 6 a.m. to Caldwell Technologies' legal department, copying Victor and, for good measure, the head of IT, Peterson, the man who had stood awkwardly by while I was escorted out of the building. Then came the definitive, irreversible action. I accessed the back-end administration panel of the Sentinel Protocol using the master developer credentials. Credentials that Victor, in his hubris, had never thought to revoke because he never understood that they existed or what they controlled. With a series of keystrokes that took less than 30 seconds, I suspended the automatic license renewal scheduled to process in 72 hours. The systems wouldn't crash immediately or catastrophically. That would be deliberate sabotage and legal liability. Instead, they would begin experiencing what would appear to be random authentication failures. Client access portals would start lagging unpredictably. Internal communications would flag false security threats. Security certificates would time out one by one as the renewal protocols failed to verify against a license that no longer existed. It would feel like a building where the foundation was slowly crumbling, unnoticed at first, but becoming impossible to ignore as the walls began cracking and the floors started settling unevenly. It would be a slow-motion digital panic. I closed my laptop, set an alarm for 6:30 a.m., and tried to sleep. My mind wouldn't cooperate, cycling through scenarios and contingencies, but my body insisted on rest. Exhaustion finally won over anxiety. In that temporary room, I realized that for the first time in years, I was acting with complete honesty, professionally, morally, and personally. I was honoring the integrity of my work and the integrity of myself. Victor and Ethan thought they had left me with nothing but a list of women's shelters, believing that I, a woman who had built her entire career on competence and independence, was helpless without the Caldwell name. They were about to discover that the list I had truly needed wasn't shelters, but the sequential legal steps required to dissolve their competitive advantage. The only shelter I required was the protection of my own documented genius. The countdown had begun. I felt a surge of cold, focused energy. The game was no longer being played by Victor's outdated rules. It was being played on my architecture, and I held the kill switch. The first call came at 6:47 a.m., exactly 47 minutes after the systems would have started experiencing their initial failures. It was Victor's office line, marked as urgent in my caller identification. I watched it ring through to voicemail, sipping the bitter, weak coffee I'd made using the in-room machine. I felt nothing but a quiet, almost neutral curiosity. 3 minutes later, another call from a different Caldwell Technologies number. Then another. Then Ethan's personal cell, which I'd already blocked the previous evening. So it went straight to a notification I dismissed without reading. Victor's personal cell declined. Peterson from IT declined. Someone from their legal department, whose name I didn't recognize, declined. By noon, my phone displayed 78 missed calls and a cascading flood of text messages that grew increasingly desperate in tone as the morning progressed. The messages told their own story of mounting panic and dawning horror. Early ones. Ava, we need to discuss some technical issues. Please call at your earliest convenience. Professional, forced calm. Mid-morning. This is extremely urgent. Our primary client access portal is down. Please respond immediately. The facade cracking. Late morning. Whatever this is about, we can work it out. Just call me back. People are getting hurt. The transition to begging. And finally, from Victor himself, a message that arrived just after 11:30 a.m., short, blunt, and revealing his entire philosophy. Name your price. Name my price. As if this were simply a negotiation about money. As if everything in the world came down to finding the correct number to write on a check and watching problems disappear. The assumption embedded in those 3 words told me everything I needed to know about how fundamentally Victor had misunderstood what was happening and why. He still believed my anger, my expertise, and my intellectual property were commodities to be bought and sold. He hadn't yet grasped that I was seeking justice, not a payout. I let them sweat for 3 full days. This wasn't cruelty, although I won't pretend there wasn't a profound satisfaction in knowing they were panicking, while I sat calmly in a hotel room, drinking bad coffee and reading industry news. The silence was strategic, calculated to achieve specific objectives. First, I needed them to fully understand the extent of their dependency on systems I'd built. Second, I needed them to bring in outside consultants who would scratch their heads at code that was simultaneously brilliant in its architecture and completely impenetrable without the original documentation. Documentation that only I possessed. I needed Henry to sit in emergency board meetings, trying to explain to increasingly angry board members why the company's competitive advantage was evaporating like fog in morning sunlight. And finally, I needed Ethan to realize that his father had made a catastrophic miscalculation when he decided to discard me. On the second evening, sitting in room 847 with takeout food going cold beside my laptop, I had a sudden, overwhelming urge for connection. Not with Ethan, never with Ethan, but with the one person who had always stood in my corner, the person whose sacrifice had allowed me to even be in this position, my mother, Eleanor. I hadn't called her since I left the condo, fearing her worry. I picked up the phone, ignoring the flashing notifications from Caldwell Tech, and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the sheer relief flooding her voice. "Ava, baby, where are you? Ethan's been calling me, saying you left, that you're not answering your phone, that he's worried." "Mom," I interrupted, my voice coming out steadier than I felt, "I need you to listen." Something in my tone made her go immediately quiet. That maternal instinct that recognizes when a child needs space to speak without interruption. I told her everything. The firing based on fabricated performance issues, the shelter list Ethan had prepared, the coordinated betrayal, and the licensing agreement they had never properly read. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line, heavy with processing and emotional recalibration. Then, she said something that broke through the careful control I'd been maintaining for 2 days. "I have $48,000 in savings, Ava," Eleanor said quietly. "It's yours if you need it." The sentence hung in the air of the sterile hotel room, carrying the weight of 30 years of double shifts, skipped vacations, and relentless financial discipline. My mother, the woman who had worked the floors of the city hospital since I was 8, who had put me through college without debt through sheer will, was offering me her entire financial security. It was the total sum of her life's labor, her protection against her own uncertain future. "Mom, I don't need," I started, but she cut me off with the same gentle but absolute firmness that had gotten us both through the hardest years of my childhood. "I know you don't need it, baby. You never did. You've been taking care of yourself since you were 16 years old. But I need you to know you have it. You are not alone. You never were." I broke then, not from sadness, but from something fiercer and more complicated, profound gratitude, searing rage at the injustice done to her hard work, and unshakable determination. The tears that came with the first I'd allowed myself since Ethan had slid that shelter list across the counter. "I'm going to make them understand what they did," I told her, my voice thick with emotions I was still trying to process. "I know you are," she said with absolute certainty, her voice the anchor I needed. "And I'll be here when you do." That conversation changed something fundamental in how I understood what I was doing and why. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings or damaged pride anymore. I was doing this for Eleanor, for every hardworking, diligent person who was ever told their value was negligible because they didn't have the right last name or the inherited wealth. For every older woman who'd been discounted because of her age, her position, or her gender. This was about asserting the immutable, earned value of competence and human dignity against the empty arrogance of inherited power. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity. The anxiety and second-guessing had vanished. It was time to stop waiting and start the endgame. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began drafting the email that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic between myself and the Caldwell family forever. The message needed to be perfect, factual, not emotional, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I addressed it to Victor's private email address, the personal account he used for matters he preferred not to have documented in corporate systems. No greeting, no preamble, just a single devastating sentence. "Please find attached documentation regarding the ownership and licensing structure of the security systems currently powering Caldwell Technologies operations." The first attachment was the complete licensing agreement, highlighting the material breach conditions and my termination rights. The second contained every patent filing for the Sentinel protocol components, each one registered to Monroe Security Solutions, months before Caldwell Technologies had supposedly acquired the technology. Victor had apparently never investigated any of this, because why would he? I was just his son's wife, hired as a diversity checkbox, someone presumably too grateful for the opportunity to cause complications or assert inconvenient legal rights. The arrogance was staggering. At the bottom of the email, I added a single, chilling line that felt appropriate given the circumstances. You fired the architect. The building is noticing. I hit send at exactly 6 a.m. The symmetry felt important, marking the connection between cause and effect, between their decision to discard me and the consequences that were now materializing in ways they were only beginning to understand. My phone rang at 7:14 a.m., Victor's private cell number. I let it ring 4 times before answering, a small, necessary delay that required him to wait, to experience the brief uncertainty of whether I would pick up at all. "Ava!" His voice was stripped of its smooth authority. He sounded diminished, like a man who just discovered that the foundation of his house had been built on land he didn't own. "You need to listen," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. 3 years ago, you hired me as what you clearly viewed as a favor to your son. You assigned me maintenance work that was beneath my capabilities and never bothered to learn what I was actually building during all those late nights. You thought you were acquiring technology outright. You were renting it from me. Silence on the other end of the line. The license renewal came due 3 days ago, I continued. I declined to approve it. Every system currently keeping your company operational is now running on borrowed time. Your competitive advantage is evaporating in real time, and all of it traces directly back to the woman you fired for supposedly poor results that were actually the best performance metrics in company history. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, uncertain. "What do you want, Ava?" He still thought this was a negotiation, that everything came down to finding the right price point. "Justice," I said, "but I'll settle for watching you explain to your board of directors why your company's entire infrastructure is held together with licensing agreements controlled by the woman you just fired for fabricated performance issues." Victor quickly shifted into his salvage mode. "We can offer you reinstatement immediately. Vice president level, equity stake in the company, full benefits, whatever it takes to make this right." "I don't want to work for you, Victor," I said, meaning it with a clarity that surprised me with its completeness. "I want you to understand what you destroyed wasn't just a job. It was a partnership you never deserved and never appreciated until it was too late to matter." I ended the call before he could respond. The conversation had served its purpose. The industry had moved faster than I had anticipated. Within hours of Caldwell Technologies' system failures becoming visible to clients and competitors, my inbox began filling with messages from other companies. By the end of the day, I had 3 formal job offers. One was a vice president role at Titanium Solutions, a high-growth competitor known for valuing meritocracy, paying more than double what Caldwell had and coming with a signing bonus that exceeded Ethan's annual salary. I accepted before midnight, stepping into something I'd built for myself on my own terms. 6 weeks later, the news broke publicly. Caldwell Technologies issued a press release that was a masterpiece of corporate obfuscation. CEO Victor Caldwell has agreed to temporary administrative leave pending a comprehensive evaluation of corporate governance practices. Temporary administrative leave meant he was forced out. Comprehensive evaluation meant investigators were examining everything with suspicion. Caldwell's stock dropped 18% before trading was halted. Ethan started calling again during week 7. I unblocked his number, curious. His voicemails told the story of his own mounting panic. The board is talking about forcing Dad out permanently. His reputation is being destroyed. Is that what you wanted? To humiliate him publicly? The underlying assumption was still that I was the aggressor, orchestrating destruction instead of simply withdrawing support they had taken for granted. On week 8, Ethan showed up at my new office building downtown with expensive, wilted roses, requesting to see me. I pulled up the security camera feed. He looked smaller, the confidence he'd carried so easily replaced by visible uncertainty. No, I told the security guard. Tell him I'm in a meeting that's running long. He should try calling if he needs to discuss something. I watched on the monitor as he left the flowers and walked out, shoulders hunched. I felt nothing, not anger, not grief, just a neutral observation. The life they had built on control and ego was collapsing, and my focus was already on the future I was actively constructing at Titanium Solutions. I was finally free of their gravity. My new position at Titanium Solutions provided exactly what Caldwell Technologies had denied: autonomy, resources, and genuine recognition. I had a team of 20 engineers who had been selected for competence rather than politics, and leadership that understood the crucial difference between control and trust. More importantly, I had the freedom to build something new without constantly defending its existence. But the anger, while useful, was a toxic fuel. I realized that my revenge couldn't just be professional success. It had to be a humanitarian counteract. If Victor's sin was the systemic erasure of talent, my legacy had to be the systemic affirmation of it. From this realization, I created the Monroe Fellowship Program, funded by my signing bonus from Titanium Solutions and dedicated to my mother, Eleanor. It was structured specifically for women who had been pushed out of toxic, male-dominated workplaces for being too aggressive, too competent, or simply not a cultural fit. It provided technical training, professional development resources, and most importantly, a community that understood what they had experienced and why it mattered. It was a formal acknowledgement that the most effective response to being discarded is to build a structure that prevents it from happening to others. This was my true revenge, creating a system of human value and recognition. Then, 6 months after I left, the letter arrived. A courier knocked on my apartment door on a Saturday morning, holding a manila envelope that required a signature. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream stationery, Victor Caldwell's personal letterhead embossed at the top. But the letter itself was handwritten in fountain pen, and the content was startling in its complete departure from anything I had previously heard from Victor. Ava, I request the opportunity to speak with you in person, not as former employer to employee, but as one person to another. I have come to understand the magnitude of my errors in judgment. Whatever you believe about my motivations, please allow me one conversation. I will come to wherever you designate whenever you're available. This is not a negotiation. It is a request for the chance to apologize properly. I read it 3 times, searching for the trap, the hidden manipulation. But the words just sounded tired, like an old man who'd finally calculated the full cost of his decisions and found the price steeper than he'd anticipated. My mother, Eleanor, offered a beautiful perspective when I asked her opinion. Sometimes people need to say they're sorry out loud, she said in the gentle but wise tone of a nurse who has seen life and death, regret and peace. Not for you, necessarily, but so they can live with themselves afterward. You don't owe him that opportunity, but you might owe yourself the closure of hearing him acknowledge what he did. I chose a quiet cafe 3 blocks from my office, neutral territory. Victor walked in exactly at 10 a.m. He looked smaller than I remembered. The arrogance that used to fill rooms had contracted into something more uncertain, more human. He ordered coffee but never drank it. I convinced myself I was making a business decision when I fired you, he began, his voice lacking its usual command. I was lying to myself. The truth is you scared me, not because you were incompetent, but because you were brilliant in ways I didn't fully understand and couldn't control. You were building systems that I couldn't claim credit for. And instead of recognizing that as success, as exactly what good leadership should enable, I saw it as a threat to my position and my narrative about being the irreplaceable genius behind the company. The honesty was unexpected, disarming. So, you destroyed what you couldn't control. I asked quietly. Yes, he replied, looking directly at me. And in doing so, I destroyed my company's future, my son's marriage, and whatever legacy I thought I was building. I turned something that could have been a genuine partnership into a power struggle that I've lost in every meaningful way. He didn't ask for anything. He just apologized, acknowledged what he'd done, and accepted that the damage was beyond simple repair. When we parted ways, I felt a profound loosening of the anger I'd been carrying like armor. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was release. Victor Caldwell, the titan of industry, had learned his lesson not through financial loss, but through the bitter humility of admitting his lifelong error in judgment, the sin of underestimating human value. The conversations with Victor and Ethan provided something I hadn't expected. Completion. Closure, I realized, wasn't about reconciliation. It was simply deciding that the story was finished, that no additional chapters would be written, and that what had happened could finally be relegated to the past tense. I sent 2 final, brief emails. One to Victor, setting clear professional boundaries for the ongoing licensing agreement, and one to Ethan, stating that while I wished him well, the absent trust could not be rebuilt from these particular ruins. 6 months after leaving Caldwell Technologies, Monroe Security Solutions had transformed from a protective shell into something substantial and real. I formalized a partnership with a talented engineer from Titanium Solutions, and we rented office space in a renovated downtown building. We structured our leadership to be genuinely collaborative, not hierarchical. Profit sharing was built into employment contracts from the beginning, ensuring that the people doing the work benefited proportionally from its success. Our focus was on talent, not pedigree. In March, we landed a major government contract, providing security infrastructure for federal database systems. The irony was sweet. I had gone from being fired for fabricated, poor performance to being trusted with national security architecture. Our first-year revenue exceeded what Caldwell Technologies' entire security division had generated. Trade publications started requesting interviews, and I accepted selectively, careful to frame my narrative in ways that emphasized resilience and creation, not revenge. When someone tries to erase your contributions, I told a journalist from a major tech magazine, the most powerful response isn't confrontation or destruction. It's building something so undeniably yours that they can never take credit for it. Something that exists completely independent of their acknowledgement or approval. The article ran with the headline, "The Architect Who Built Her Own Empire." My mother, Eleanor, flew in for the opening of our expanded office space in May. She walked through the collaborative space slowly, taking in the glass walls that made work visible, the kitchen where employees actually gathered. "Your father would have been so proud," she whispered. "I didn't do this alone, Mom. I said, hugging her tightly. You taught me everything that made this possible. How to keep going when circumstances seem impossible. No, baby, she corrected, with a gentle smile that held decades of wisdom. I taught you how to survive. You taught yourself how to build, how to create rather than just endure. That's different, and it's all you. My success wasn't the material wealth. It was the ability to create a safe space for others, the Monroe Fellowship, and the ability to be truly happy, unburdened by the need for external validation. Victor officially retired. Ethan relocated to the West Coast for a fresh start in sales. Their empire contracted, but mine was expanding, built on the rock-solid foundation of merit and respect. I learned the most essential truth through all of this. The most effective response to being erased isn't the destruction of those who wronged you. It's building something so undeniably your own that they become irrelevant footnotes in a story they no longer have the right to narrate. I drove home to my apartment, modest but genuinely mine, filled with books I actually read and art that meant something personal. My phone showed a text from Eleanor. Proud of you every single day. I closed my laptop to review proposals for the next phase of company expansion, because that's what architects do. We build. If this story of strategic justice and quiet triumph captivated you, if you recognize the core value of hard work over inherited privilege, hit that like button right now. My favorite part wasn't Victor's financial loss. It was the moment Eleanor offered her life savings, showing that true wealth lies in unconditional human connection and experience. What was your favorite moment of Ava's reinvention? Was it the precision of Clause 12D? Was it the quiet dignity of her goodbye to Ethan? Or was it the moment she established the Monroe Fellowship, creating opportunity from her own pain? Drop it in the comments below. Remember this: your value is not determined by whether other people recognize it. Stop building things for people who treat your contributions like favors they are granting you. Build something for yourself. Build your own empire. Thank you for watching and supporting stories of resilience and redemption.